7 men stood at the edge of the woods on the evening of September 23, 1861. The thick Louisiana air caught the swing of their lanterns. Rifles rested easy on their shoulders. They weren't out for deer or wild hogs that night. They were hunting a child, a 9-year-old boy who'd run off 3 days earlier from the Hollow Pines plantation. The man who owned him, Edmund Tarot, demanded his return. Not because the boy worked hard, not because he held value in any real sense, but because he was property. And Edmund Tarot wasn't the type to let his property simply walk away. The boy didn't have a name anyone bothered to use. The other slaves called him Silence because he never spoke. Not a single word. Not even a sound. He just stared with those pale eyes that sat wrong against his dark skin. Eyes like fragments of broken glass, the kind that made grown men drop their gaze first. Samuel Vickers led the party. Nearly 60, face weathered like old leather, hands that had grabbed more runaways than he could keep track of. He knew every trick, every hiding spot, every trail. Samuel had started this line of work when he was barely 20. His father had been an overseer, and Samuel learned early on that some people were worth money and others simply weren't. That's how he made sense of the world. Clean and simple. No questions asked. Beside him walked Thomas Harlow, a younger man with a red beard and a mean streak that bled through in everything he did. Thomas came from Virginia, had moved south 5 years back when he heard the money was good for catching runaways. He had a talent for it, quiet when the situation called for it, loud when that served him better. He'd bagged 43 slaves in those 5 years, kept count in a little notebook he carried in his vest pocket. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know which city you're listening from. Appreciate it. Now, let's continue. The Moss brothers, Caleb and Jacob, joined because they genuinely enjoyed the work. They'd grown up on a plantation where their father worked as a supervisor until he drowned in the Atchafalaya River under circumstances nobody discussed. Both men were built big, thick through the shoulders with hands like hammers. They kept to themselves mostly, didn't talk much to anyone except each other. They had their method down. Caleb would swing left, Jacob would swing right, and whatever was caught in the middle had nowhere left to run. Robert Whittaker stayed quiet like he always did. Maybe 35, maybe 40. Nobody really knew. He'd turned up in Lafayette Parish 7 years back and started taking work as a tracker. He was the best among them at reading signs. A blade of grass bent wrong, a scuff mark on bark, the way moss grew on one side of a tree instead of the other. Robert could follow a trail 3 days old, even after rain, but he never spoke about how he'd learned it. Never mentioned where he came from, just did the work and collected his pay. Nathaniel Cross carried a Bible he never actually opened. A thin man with a narrow face and eyes that never seemed to land on anything for very long. He always dressed in black, like he was heading to a funeral. Maybe he was. Nathaniel had a habit of quoting scripture, usually the parts about servants obeying masters, about order, and knowing your place in the hierarchy. It made him feel righteous, made the work feel like part of God's design instead of what it really was. And then there was Elijah Thorne, barely 19, desperate to prove he was tough. This was only his 3rd hunt. The first 2 had been straightforward. Elderly slaves who couldn't run fast. People who gave up quick. This one felt different. A boy who disappeared without leaving any trace. A boy the other slaves whispered about like he wasn't quite human. Elijah wanted to be the one who caught him. Wanted to drag him back and see the respect in the other men's eyes. They pushed into the old forest where the trees grew so tight together that daylight barely touched the ground. This forest had stood long before anyone could remember. Longer than the town, longer than the plantation itself. The trees were enormous, some of them 10 feet across at the base. Oak and cypress and something else, without a name that anyone knew. Dead leaves had built up in layers so deep your boots sank with every step. The air hung thick with the smell of rot and earth and stagnant water. Somewhere off in the distance, a creek moved slow and lazy, but here in the deep part of the woods, everything sat perfectly still. No crickets, no owls, no wind through the branches, just their own breathing bouncing back between the trunks and the sound of boots crushing leaves. Samuel had worked these woods dozens of times. He knew the paths, the clearings, the places where water pooled. He knew where people went when they ran. But as they pushed deeper, something started to feel wrong. The trees looked different. The spaces between them stretched wider than they should have, and the air carried a smell that hadn't been there before. Something cold. Something that made the hair on his arms stand up. They walked, maybe an hour before Samuel stopped dead. There was a house in the middle of the clearing ahead. He'd passed through this exact spot a dozen times. There had never been a house here. Never. He would have remembered. Anyone would have. But there it stood, built from dark rotting wood that looked 100 years old. The boards were warped and split. The windows were narrow slits boarded up from the inside with planks that had rusty nails poking through. The roof tilted at a strange angle, like whoever built it hadn't cared if it stood straight or fell down. Thomas walked up slow and touched the wall. The wood was ice cold. Too cold for wood, sitting in Louisiana heat in September. It felt like touching stone pulled up from a river bottom. He jerked his hand back and wiped it on his pants. "Anyone seen this place before?" he asked, but his voice came out smaller than he meant it to. Nobody answered. They all just stared. Caleb moved around the side, looking for windows they could see through. There weren't any. Just those narrow gaps with boards nailed across them. He pressed his face close to one and tried to peer through the cracks. Couldn't see anything but darkness. Complete darkness, even though it was still afternoon outside. "How'd we miss this?" Jacob asked. "How'd we walk right past this before and not see it?" Samuel had no answer. He circled the whole structure, studying it from every angle. No footprints in the dirt around the foundation, no marks in the leaves, no sign anyone had been here recently. But he knew the boy was inside. He could feel it. A certainty that settled in his chest like a weight. The house seemed to be waiting, seemed to be breathing slow and patient. "We're going in," Samuel said, and his voice sounded strange in all that quiet. The door wasn't locked. An old iron handle, rusted almost through. Thomas grabbed it and pulled. The door swung open smooth and silent. No creak, no resistance, like it had been oiled yesterday. But the hinges were thick with rust. The opening showed nothing but darkness inside. Their lanterns should have lit up the interior, but the light seemed to stop at the threshold, like a wall of shadow sat just inside the doorway. Samuel went in first. He had to. He was the leader. He stepped through and felt the temperature drop 20 degrees in an instant. His breath came out in a cloud. In September in Louisiana, the others followed one by one, lanterns raised, rifles ready. The inside was wrong from the start. The main room stretched out much further than it should have based on the size of the building they'd seen from outside. The walls ran back and back into darkness their lanterns couldn't reach. The ceiling hung low, maybe 7 feet, with exposed beams that looked carved from single massive trees. The floor was wood covered in a layer of dust that seemed decades old, but the dust wasn't even. There were marks in it, tracks, patterns. "What the hell is this place?" Caleb whispered. Nobody answered because nobody knew. Thomas tried to brighten his lantern. He turned the wick up, but the flame just guttered and died. He lit it again. It died again. Every time he got it going, it would flicker and go out after a few seconds. Like something in the air was snuffing it. Like the house was swallowing the light before it could spread. In the dim glow from the other lanterns, they could see the walls. That's when everyone went quiet. The walls were covered in writing, not painted, not written with ink, carved, scratched deep into the wood with something sharp. Fingernails maybe, or broken glass, or pieces of metal. The writing went from floor to ceiling, every inch covered in words and symbols. Some of it was English, some was Spanish. Some was in languages none of them recognized. African languages maybe, or something older. "These are names," Jacob said, running his finger along the wall. His voice shook just a little. "These are all names." Samuel's chest tightened. He moved closer and held his lantern up. The names were organized by date. He saw Thomas and Margaret and Samuel and dozens of others. Next to each name was a year, 1852, 1847, 1839. The dates went all the way back to 1798, over 60 years of names. "I know some of these," Samuel said quietly. His finger stopped on one name. Peter. Disappeared in 49. They said he made it north. He moved to another. Elizabeth, 51. Found her body in the river, but everyone said she drowned running. Another name, Moses, 56. Never found him. The names went on and on, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. All slaves who'd run, all people who'd disappeared. Their names were here, scratched into this wood like a memorial, or a list, or a promise. Thomas felt sick. He'd hunted some of these people. He opened his little notebook and checked. 3 names on this wall matched names in his book. People he'd been paid to find and never did. People he'd assumed made it north or died in the swamps. But they'd been here in this house somehow. Then they heard it. A sound from below. Breathing, slow and steady and deliberate, coming from underneath the floorboards. Not one person breathing. Many, like a dozen people, all breathing in perfect rhythm. Robert knelt down and pressed his ear to the floor. The breathing got louder. He could feel it vibrating through the wood. He stood up fast and backed away. "There's something under us," he said. They spread out, looking for a way down. Nathaniel found it in the corner, hidden under a pile of old straw and dirt that had been carefully placed to look natural. A wooden hatch, maybe 3 feet square, with an iron ring set into it. Samuel and Caleb grabbed the ring together and pulled. The hatch was heavy, heavier than it should be. They strained and heaved, and finally it came up with a grinding sound. A smell rolled out from below that made them all step back. Rust and wet earth and something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left out in the sun. Like blood gone bad. "There's stairs," Thomas said, leaning over the opening. Wooden stairs descended into complete darkness. The breathing sound was louder now. Clear. Rhythmic. Waiting. Samuel went first again. He had to. That's what leaders did. He put his foot on the first step, and it creaked under his weight. The wood was soft, almost spongy. He took another step. Another. The others followed, single file, lanterns held high. The stairs went down much further than they should have. The house couldn't have been more than 1 story tall from the outside. But they descended for what felt like 30 feet. The walls on either side were packed dirt, held up by wooden beams that looked ancient. More scratches. More names. More dates all the way down. At the bottom, they found themselves in a basement that shouldn't exist. It was huge. The ceiling was low, but the room stretched out in all directions, supported by thick wooden pillars carved with symbols. The same symbols from upstairs. The floor was hard, packed dirt. And covering every pillar, every wooden beam, every inch of wall were more names, more dates, more scratches. This was a tomb, a memorial, a record of everyone who died running. Everyone who'd been hunted. Everyone who'd been caught. And at the far end, standing perfectly still in the darkness with his back to them, was the boy. He didn't run, didn't move. Just stood there facing the wall, his small frame barely visible in the lantern light. He wore the same torn shirt and pants he'd had on when he disappeared 3 days ago. His feet were bare. His hands hung at his sides. "Got you now, boy," Samuel said, moving forward. His voice sounded hollow in the big space. The boy turned around slowly. His eyes caught the lantern light and reflected it back like an animal's. Those pale glass, like eyes that didn't match his dark skin. He looked at each of them one by one, taking his time. Not with fear, not with anger. With something else, something that made Thomas take a step back without meaning to. The boy's face was calm. Empty. Like he was looking through them instead of at them. Like he was seeing something behind them that they couldn't see. "What's your name, boy?" Thomas asked, trying to sound tough. The boy didn't answer. He never did. But he kept staring right into Thomas's eyes. And Thomas felt something break inside his head, like a door he didn't know was there suddenly swinging open. Images flooded in. Faces. Dozens of them. People he'd hunted over the years. People he'd caught and dragged back in chains. People he'd hurt when they fought back. People whose names he'd written in his little notebook and then forgotten. But they hadn't forgotten him. He saw Mary, 8 months pregnant, when he caught her in 1857. She'd tried to run because her baby was about to be sold away from her. Thomas had dragged her back and watched as they sold the baby the next day. He remembered thinking it was just business. Just the way things worked. He saw Marcus. Ran after his wife was beaten to death by an overseer. Thomas caught him after 2 days and brought him back. They hanged Marcus as an example. Thomas got paid double. He saw Sarah and her 2 children. He'd found them hiding in a barn 20 miles north. The children were 5 and 7. They'd cried the whole way back. Thomas had told them to shut up, or he'd make them shut up. They'd shut up. All of them were looking at him now, all at once, through the boy's eyes. Staring. Accusing. Remembering. Thomas dropped his lantern. It hit the ground and shattered, oil spreading across the dirt. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The words were gone. His name was gone. He couldn't remember who he was, where he was, why he was here. He fell to his knees, gasping like he'd been held underwater. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't touched him, just looked at him. "What's wrong with you?" Caleb snapped, but there was fear in his voice now. Thomas couldn't answer. He'd forgotten how to talk, how to make his mouth form words. He clutched his head and made a sound like an animal. Samuel felt the air change. The temperature dropped even more. He could see his breath now, thick clouds in the lantern light. Something was very wrong. The house felt alive, aware, like it had been sleeping and now it was waking up, like it was pleased they were here. "We need to leave," Robert said. First thing he'd said since they entered the house. "We came for the boy," Samuel shot back. "We're taking him." But when he moved toward the child, his legs wouldn't work right. They felt heavy, like walking through mud, like invisible hands were holding him back. The boy tilted his head slightly, still not speaking, and Samuel heard something, voices, many voices whispering all around him in the darkness. Names, dates, prayers in languages he didn't understand, pleas for mercy, screams, crying. All of it at once, filling his head until he thought his skull would crack. He recognized some of the voices, people he'd caught, people he'd dragged back, people who'd begged him to let them go, and he'd laughed at them. They were all here in this house, in these walls. Elijah, the youngest, started crying. He didn't know why. The tears just came. He felt it all at once. Every person he'd helped catch in his 3 hunts. Every chain he'd locked. Every plea he'd ignored. The weight of it crushed him. He told himself it was just a job. Just the way things were. That's what everyone said. But now in this place, those words meant nothing. He sank to the floor, sobbing like a child. "This ain't natural," Nathaniel said, clutching his Bible with both hands. His voice was high and tight. "This is the devil's work. This is—" The boy finally moved. He walked past them slow and steady, heading toward the stairs. Not running. Not scared. Just walking. Like he owned the place. Like they were the ones trapped here. Not him. His bare feet made no sound on the dirt floor. He passed within 2 feet of Samuel, and the old man couldn't move. Couldn't reach out. Couldn't do anything but watch. Caleb tried to grab him. His hand went right through empty air, even though the boy was clearly there. Solid. Real. Jacob lunged next. Same thing. It was like trying to catch smoke. Or a memory. Or a ghost. The boy reached the stairs and started climbing. Still slow. Still calm. Like he had all the time in the world. Then he stopped. Turned around. Looked back at them one more time. And that's when they started turning on each other. It wasn't planned. Wasn't rational. Samuel suddenly looked at Thomas and saw the man who'd stolen his best bounty 3 years ago. Taken credit for a catch Samuel had made, gotten paid for Samuel's work. The anger that Samuel had buried came flooding back. Fresh, raw, like it had just happened. Thomas looked at Samuel and saw the man who'd gotten his brother killed on a hunt 5 years back. Samuel had said it was safe. Said the slave they were chasing wasn't armed. But he was. And Thomas's brother took a bullet in the chest. Died screaming in the mud. And Samuel had just shrugged and said, "These things happen." The Moss brothers remembered every slight. Every time one of the others had gotten a bigger share. Every joke at their expense. Every moment of disrespect. All the resentment they'd swallowed over the years came bubbling up like poison. Nathaniel's hand went to the knife on his belt. His eyes darted from man to man, suddenly certain that one of them was planning to kill him and take his share. That's what people did. That's how the world worked. Trust no one. Robert backed into a corner, eyes wild, seeing threats everywhere. "You set this up," Caleb said, pointing at Samuel. His voice was loud in the enclosed space. "You brought us here to die. You and the boy. You planned this. You're out of your mind." Samuel spat back. But even as he said it, he started to wonder. Had Robert been acting strange on the walk here? Had Jacob been too quiet? Were they all in on something? The suspicion spread like a disease. Within seconds, each man was certain the others were enemies. That they'd always been enemies. That this had all been a trap. The boy climbed the stairs above them, while below the 7 men began to shout, to push, to accuse, to draw weapons. The first shot was fired by Nathaniel. He claimed later that he didn't mean to. That his finger slipped. That the gun just went off. But the bullet hit Jacob in the shoulder, and Jacob screamed and tackled Nathaniel to the ground. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt, punching and clawing. Caleb grabbed his brother, trying to pull him off. Samuel raised his rifle, not sure who to point it at. Thomas was still on the ground, mumbling names he didn't recognize, lost in whatever the boy had shown him. Elijah was crying in the corner, curled into a ball. Robert just watched. He didn't fight. Didn't join in. Just watched with those empty eyes. Elijah finally snapped out of it and ran for the stairs. He had to get out. Had to get away from this place. He made it to the bottom step and started climbing. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. But the stairs kept going. He climbed and climbed, but never seemed to get any higher. The top never got closer. It was like climbing in a dream. Running but not moving. Desperate but trapped. Finally, he collapsed halfway up, exhausted, and crawled back down on his hands and knees. Below, the fight continued. Jacob had gotten Nathaniel's knife away from him and was pressing it against his throat. Caleb was trying to pull his brother off, but Jacob elbowed him in the face. Caleb stumbled back, blood pouring from his nose. Samuel fired his rifle into the ceiling, trying to get everyone's attention. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment, everyone froze. "We need to get out of here," Samuel shouted. "This place is making us crazy." But even as he said it, he looked at the others and felt the suspicion creeping back. Robert was standing too still, too calm, like he'd expected this, like he'd known. In the chaos, Robert had moved to the far wall. There was something there. A piece of paper yellowed with age, tucked into a crack in the wood. He pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. The paper crackled, dry and brittle. He held it up to his lantern and read. The handwriting was careful, precise, like someone who'd been educated, someone who knew how to write properly. Not like most slaves who'd never been taught. "My name is Elias Carter," the letter began. "I was born in Virginia in 1821. I was taught to read and write by the master's daughter before they sold me south when I was 15. I was brought to Louisiana in chains. I was owned by 5 different men over the years. I learned carpentry. I learned stonemasonry. I learned how to build things that would last. In 1850, I was purchased by Edmund Tarot to work on his plantation. He needed someone to build a new storage house in the woods, somewhere to keep tools and supplies away from the main buildings, somewhere hidden. He brought me out here and showed me this clearing. He told me to build something that would stand for 100 years. But I didn't build what he asked for. I built something else. I built this house. I built it with purpose. I built it with memory. Every nail I drove, I spoke a name. Every board I cut, I remembered a face. Every beam I raised, I said a prayer. This is not shelter. This is not storage. This is a monument. This is a trap. This is revenge. I carved the names of everyone I'd known who died running. Everyone who died fighting. Everyone who was hunted like an animal and killed like one too. I put their names in these walls. I put their memory in this wood. I made this place remember. I made it wait. Edmund Tarot killed me when I finished. He didn't like how the house looked. Said it wasn't what he wanted. He beat me to death with a shovel and buried me in the woods. But the house was already complete. The house was already awake. It knows what it is. It knows what it's for. One day, the hunters will come inside. Men like the ones who caught me. Men like the ones who killed my friends. Men who think people are property and property can't fight back. They'll come inside thinking they're chasing someone. Thinking they're in control. But the house will teach them different. The house will show them every face they forgot. Every name they never learned. Every person they hurt. The house takes names. It gives them back when it's done. When it's finished teaching. When everyone understands what they did. Some will die here. Some will leave. But none of them will be the same. None of them will forget again. This is my work. This is my legacy. This house will stand longer than any plantation. Will remember longer than any master. Will wait as long as it takes for justice. For balance. For truth. My name is Elias Carter. I built this house in 1850 and I'm still here. E. The letter ended there. No signature. Just those words. Robert looked up from the paper. The fighting had stopped. Everyone was staring at him. Even Thomas had crawled closer to listen. This whole place is a trap, Robert said quietly. It was built to catch us. Built to catch people like us. We were supposed to come here. That's insane, Samuel said, but his voice shook. Is it? Robert asked. He gestured at the walls covered in names. How many of these people did we catch? How many did we drag back? How many did we forget about the next day because it was just another job? Nobody answered. The boy was gone. They hadn't seen him leave, but he was no longer on the stairs, no longer in the basement. Just gone, like he'd never been there at all, or like he'd been part of the house from the beginning. Bait. A lure. Something to get them inside. "We need to leave now," Robert said. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. "Right now." Samuel nodded. For once he agreed. They gathered their weapons, their lanterns. Jacob helped Nathaniel up. His throat was bruised but not cut. Caleb wiped the blood from his face. Elijah stopped crying and got to his feet. Thomas was still mumbling, but he could walk. They moved toward the stairs together. Samuel went first. He climbed slowly, testing each step. Behind him came Robert, then the Moss brothers, then Nathaniel, then Elijah. Thomas brought up the rear, still not quite right, still seeing things the rest of them couldn't see. The stairs seemed normal now. They climbed up and reached the main floor. The room looked different, smaller, more normal. The darkness had lifted somewhat. They could see the door clearly now. It was open, showing trees and daylight beyond. Samuel walked toward it. 20 feet. 15. 10. He reached out for the door frame, and the house screamed. Not a human scream. Something else. Something that came from the walls themselves. From the wood and the nails and the very foundation. A sound like 1,000 voices all crying out at once. Names, 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 overlapping and echoing and demanding to be heard. Samuel fell to his knees, clutching his ears. The others did the same. The sound was inside their heads, inside their bones. They couldn't shut it out. And then they saw them, shadows, shapes, figures standing along the walls, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, men and women and children, all watching, all waiting, all silent, except for the screaming that wouldn't stop. Samuel recognized faces. People he'd caught years ago. People he'd forgotten about. They stood there looking at him with eyes that held no forgiveness, no mercy, just memory, just truth. Thomas saw the pregnant woman, Mary, standing in the corner with her hands on her belly, staring at him. Caleb and Jacob saw the man they'd beaten nearly to death for trying to run. They'd laughed about it afterward, joked about how he'd begged. But he wasn't begging now. He was just watching. Nathaniel saw a woman he'd caught and returned to a master known for his cruelty. She'd screamed when they handed her over. Screamed until they gagged her. She wasn't screaming now, just looking. Elijah saw an old man he'd tracked through the swamps for 2 days. The man had been so tired he could barely walk when Elijah found him. Elijah had tied him to a tree and gone for help. When he came back, the man was dead. Heart had given out. Elijah had still collected his fee. The old man stood in the shadows now. Patient and still, the shadows didn't move. Didn't speak, didn't threaten, they just watched, witnessed, remembered. Robert was the first to break. He ran for the door, not looking back, not caring about the others. He crashed through the opening and out into the forest. The screaming stopped the moment he crossed the threshold. He stumbled forward, gasping, and kept running. He didn't look back to see if anyone followed. Inside the house, the remaining 6 men were trapped in their own memories, each one seeing different faces, different moments, different crimes they'd committed and forgotten. The house was teaching them, showing them, making them remember every single person they'd treated as less than human. Samuel finally looked up. The shadows were closer now, surrounding them, and among them, standing in the center, was the boy. Those pale eyes shining in the dim light. He raised one hand and pointed at Samuel. Just pointed, didn't speak. Samuel felt something break inside him. Something that had kept him going all these years. Some wall he'd built between himself and the things he'd done. It crumbled all at once, and he saw himself clearly for the first time. Saw what he'd become, what he'd always been. And he couldn't bear it. He started screaming, not from pain, from understanding, from seeing himself through the eyes of everyone he'd hurt, from knowing there was no justification, no excuse, no way to make it right. The others were breaking too, one by one. Jacob was clawing at his own face, trying to make the vision stop. Caleb was on his knees, vomiting. Nathaniel had curled into a ball, his Bible clutched to his chest, speaking in tongues. Thomas was sitting perfectly still, staring at nothing, tears running down his face. Elijah was crying again, but this time he knew exactly why. The boy lowered his hand and turned away. He walked toward the back of the house, toward a door they hadn't noticed before. He opened it and stepped through. Behind him, the door closed and disappeared like it had never been there. The shadows faded. The screaming stopped. The house went quiet. Samuel was the first to move. He crawled toward the front door on his hands and knees. Made it outside. The sunlight felt like knives. He collapsed on the ground, gasping, trying to remember how to breathe properly. One by one, the others came out. Jacob first helping his brother, then Nathaniel still clutching his Bible. Then Elijah stumbling like a drunk. Then Thomas, empty-eyed and silent. They stood in the clearing, not looking at each other, not speaking. The house loomed behind them, silent, waiting, patient. "We should burn it," Caleb said hoarsely. Nobody moved. "We should burn this whole place to the ground," he said again louder. Samuel shook his head slowly. "Won't work. You can't burn memory. Can't destroy it. It'll always be here. Always waiting." They walked back to Hollow Pines in silence. It took 2 hours. Nobody spoke the entire way. When they reached the plantation, Edmund Tarot was waiting. "Where's the boy?" he demanded. Nobody answered at first. Then Samuel looked up at him with empty eyes. "There is no boy," he said. "There never was. Just ghosts. Just memory. Just everything we pretended wasn't real." Tarot stared at him. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm done," Samuel said. "I'm done with all of it. I won't hunt anymore. Won't catch anyone. Won't drag anyone back. I'm done." He turned and walked away. Tarot shouted after him, but Samuel didn't stop. Didn't look back. The others dispersed slowly. Jacob and Caleb got on their horses and rode out without a word. Nathaniel clutched his Bible and walked toward the road. Thomas stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, then turned and walked into the woods. Not toward the house. Just away. Away from everything. Elijah sat down on the ground and cried. He was still crying when the sun went down. Only Robert had run. Only Robert had made it out first. And only Robert had taken the letter. He made it back to New Orleans 2 days later, rented a small room in the French Quarter, locked the door, and started writing. He wrote every name he could remember, every person he'd tracked, every face he'd seen. He wrote them on the walls in small, careful letters. He filled one wall, then another, then another. He couldn't stop. The names kept coming, kept flooding his memory. People he thought he'd forgotten, people he'd never known the names of. But somehow now he knew. Now he remembered. The landlady worried when he didn't answer. She used her key and found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by walls covered in names. He was still writing. His fingers were bloody from pressing the pencil so hard. But he kept going. "Sir," she said. "Sir, are you all right?" Robert didn't look at her. Just kept writing. She backed out and locked the door. Left him there. What else could she do? 3 months later, Thomas Harlow was found dead in a boarding house in Baton Rouge. He'd hung himself with his own belt from a low beam. It took him a long time to die. Slow strangulation. The owner said he'd been mumbling names for weeks, writing them in a notebook, crossing them out, writing them again. The notebook was filled with names and dates and notes about people he'd caught. The last page just said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." repeated until the words ran together. Samuel Vickers was found 6 months after that. He'd walked into the Atchafalaya swamp and never came out. Search parties found his body weeks later. He'd clawed his own face so badly that they could barely identify him. The coroner said it looked like he'd been trying to tear his own eyes out, like he couldn't bear to see any more. Caleb and Jacob Moss killed each other in a fight over nothing. A card game gone wrong, or so people said. But the witnesses reported something strange. Before they drew their knives, both brothers had been staring at the wall, staring at something nobody else could see, and they'd been calling out names, asking for forgiveness. Then they turned on each other like animals. Nathaniel Cross lived longer. He became a preacher, traveled from town to town, giving sermons about sin and redemption and the weight of the past. People said his sermons were powerful, made strong men cry. But Nathaniel never smiled, never laughed, never seemed to find the forgiveness he preached about. He died in 1865, the same year the war ended, choked to death on a piece of bread. But the doctor said there was nothing in his throat. Nothing physical anyway. Like his body had just forgotten how to swallow, how to breathe, like it had given up. Elijah Thorne was the youngest. He lived until 1870. Never hunted again, never did much of anything, worked as a clerk in a dry goods store. Lived alone, never married, never had friends. People who knew him said he was polite but empty, like there was nobody home behind his eyes. He died from what the doctor called failure to thrive. Just wasted away over the course of a year, lost weight, lost energy, lost the will to keep living. He was 38 years old but looked 70. Robert Whittaker wrote names on his walls until there was no space left. Every inch of every wall covered in small, cramped handwriting. The landlady said that after he died, new names kept appearing. Names she didn't write. Names in handwriting that wasn't hers. Names that showed up overnight on walls she knew had been full the day before. She tried to paint over them. The names bled through. She tried wallpaper. The names showed through the paper. Finally, she stopped renting that room, locked it up, put furniture in front of the door. But on quiet nights, she could hear something in there. A scratching sound like someone writing. Always writing. Never stopping. The house in the woods still stands. Or at least that's what people say. Edmund Tarot tried to have it burned down a week after the hunters came back changed. He sent 20 men with torches and oil. They poured the oil on the walls, lit the torches, threw them through the windows. The flames died the moment they touched the wood. They tried again, same result. The fire wouldn't catch, wouldn't spread, wouldn't consume. The house just stood there, dark and patient and waiting. Eventually, they gave up. Tarot ordered everyone to stay away from that part of the forest, made it forbidden territory. But slaves still disappeared sometimes, and some of them were found later wandering out of the woods with empty eyes and no memory of where they'd been. They'd been in the house. That's what the other slaves said. The house that protected runaways. The house that punished hunters. The house that remembered. After the war ended, the Hollow Pines plantation fell apart. Tarot died broke and bitter in 1868. The land was sold and resold. Eventually, it became part of a national forest. But that section of woods where the house stands is still marked on old maps with a warning: unstable ground. The official records say, not suitable for development. But locals know better. They know it's not the ground that's unstable. It's the house. It's the memory. It's the debt that some places refuse to forgive. Over the years, people have reported seeing it. Hikers who wandered off trail. Hunters looking for deer. Teenagers looking for a thrill. They see a house that shouldn't be there. Dark wood, narrow windows, tilted roof. Some of them go inside. Most of them come out changed. A few don't come out at all. There was a sheriff's deputy in 1923 who went looking for a missing person in those woods. Found the house. Went inside. Came out 3 hours later unable to speak. Never spoke again. Just stared at walls and sometimes wrote things nobody could read. There was a historian in 1957 who wanted to document old structures in the area. Found the house. Took photographs. Every picture came out black, complete darkness. No image. She tried video. Same thing. Just darkness and sometimes sounds. Voices. Names being spoken. She destroyed all her equipment and never went back. There was a group of college students in 1984 who heard the stories and decided to investigate. 4 of them went in. 3 came out. The 4th was found 2 days later, curled up in the basement, rocking back and forth and humming a song nobody recognized. He spent the rest of his life in an institution. Never speaking, never acknowledging anyone. Just humming that song. Some of the nurses swore they heard voices in the humming. Names. Hundreds of names. The most recent incident was in 2009. A real estate developer wanted to build luxury cabins in the area. Sent a surveying team into the woods. They found the house. They were experienced professionals. They had GPS and modern equipment and radio communication. They went inside to assess whether it could be demolished. Their radios stopped working immediately. The GPS showed their location as unknown. They were inside for maybe 10 minutes. When they came out, all 3 of them quit their jobs. 1 moved to Alaska. 1 became a monk. The 3rd started a foundation dedicated to researching slavery and racial justice. When asked why, he just said, "I saw what I'd been blind to. I saw what needed to be made right." The house still stands. Waiting. Patient. Doing what it was built to do. Teaching lessons to people who've forgotten. Showing truth to people who've looked away. Holding memory when everyone else has moved on. Elias Carter built it well. Built it to last. Built it with purpose. And his purpose endures. Some places don't forget. Some places won't let you forget. Some places hold the debt until it's paid. Until everyone understands. Until everyone remembers. The house is one of those places. And it's still there in the woods. In the darkness. In the memory of a nation that tried to forget what it did and who it did it to. Still waiting. Still teaching. Still holding space for all the names that were never supposed to matter. All the people who were never supposed to be remembered. All the lives that were never supposed to count. They count now. The house makes sure of that.